from the looks of it, I'll put it that way, a 5-part series, and it's going to be scattered out because we've got other things going on over the next 6 or 8 weeks as far as intervening with our evening services. But this is a series of studies from Jeremiah, Views from the Well. And the title is pretty descriptive. It really is, and I'll explain that as we go. Jeremiah is one of what we call the major prophets, simply because of 52 chapters of material that are recorded in the book. And then you've got 5 chapters in the book of Lamentations that is accredited to him as well. But perhaps if we stop and think about the world of Jeremiah, and to kind of keep things, in our own context a little bit. Because the tendency when you deal with something that a series of events that happened 2,600 years ago on the other side of the world, to people that you've never known personally, is to either look at it simply as an academic historical lesson, or just blow it off completely as kind of irrelevant. I mean, who cares? A bunch of old dead people lived over there, right? But how does this all package together? And to kind of give an idea a little bit, look at our own world for a couple of minutes, and we'll consider some of this. Because our own world began almost 2,000 years ago as far as God's program concerns, for you and I. This is the church age. It began at the day of Pentecost. It's in Acts chapter 2, and we've been living in this church age, this period of time where God is calling out, that's the term we use, calling out believers that are going to be part of the bride of Christ. They're all packaged together. So you are part of a body that has encompassed the world for 20 centuries now. And God continues to add to that collective until we get to the last one that fills it up, fills the cup, as I mentioned this morning, to overflowing from there. In 2 Timothy, and I'm just going to refer to that, you can make a note of it, it tells us as the chapter 3 begins, in the last days perilous times shall come. And it creates a picture that is absolutely gruesome if you read through the first 5 verses. It talks about, backstabbing truce breakers. It talks about people that are violent towards authority. It talks about people of, seriously defective character, lying, cheating, stealing, you name it. My goodness, you'd almost think we're talking about Congress, wouldn't you? All kinds of things that are going on. And it says in verse 5 of that chapter that they have a form of godliness, but they deny the power thereof. In other words, they give lip service to God. They'll claim some type of religious affiliation or whatever in various capacities, but they deny the actual authority of the Godhead itself. So all kinds of things that are going on there. In fact, you could even look at the entire book of Jude if you wanted a spiritual description of the day and age we live in a general sense, as far as the overall worldview, the world philosophy. The book of Jude, of course, is about apostasy. And again, talks about during this present age, there's going to be a development of an ongoing growth and move towards more and more of an apostate mentality. What is apostasy? Well, it's a falling away. If you were going to look at the actual definition of the word, it means a falling away. Now, you have to fall away from something. Otherwise, you're not falling anywhere. You're still static. So you're falling away. Within the context of the Bible, you're falling away from the truths of God. You're falling away from biblical truths, the scriptures, the teaching of them. You're falling away from what God has declared and so forth. Jude has been called the smallest, most ignored, most misunderstood, and most unpopular book in the New Testament. Probably fits that. Makes a great study in and of itself. And mixed within this mess of this worldview, the system that we currently are living in, you find that there's a lot of good people in there. There really are. There's some great folks out there. Some of them are probably your neighbors. Some of them might think that way about you. I hope so. But there are some good people mixed up out there. Does that mean they're all Christians? No, sadly, it doesn't. Good people mixed in. In fact, some of them you kind of don't really know. You remember in Matthew 13, it talks about the kingdom parables, and in there there's one of those parables is about the wheat and the tares. You know, Christ sows the wheat kernels in the ground, and an enemy at night comes by and sows weeds. Okay, yeah. And the problem is, it's kind of like, you know, trying to thin carrots. When the carrots are this tall, okay, the way I thin them is with a rototiller. You know, just right down the middle of the road, and then plant something that's got some suds, like a tomato plant or something that I can pick out from a weed. I couldn't tell you. You know, that I can get totally confused because there's a lot of stuff that looked really a lot like little carrot plants. God tells us that that's the way the culture is going to be. Any culture, any place on earth, in any period of mankind's history, has got believers mixed in with unbelievers within its culture, within the world system that we are in. It makes it kind of hard, doesn't it? Because, yeah, they have a form of godliness, but deny the power thereof. And sometimes it takes over a period of time and some real serious conversations before you really get an inkling to actually talking about a Christian, or are we just talking about somebody who's a fake? Or are we talking about another category? Somebody who thinks they're a Christian because of, I don't know, walking an aisle, praying a prayer, you know, counting rosary beads, you know, crawling to Mecca on your knees. I don't know, whatever it happens to be. And so there are a lot of claims. I mean, we've got outright wolves. You know, Matthew 7 talks about wolves in sheep's clothing. But it also talks about people who come to the Lord at the last day and say, have we not done many wonderful works in your name? And Jesus is going to say, I never knew you. So you've got well-intentioned people full of religious zeal that just aren't going to make the cut, right? You're gonna be a problem there, it really is. And then you have another aspect of it, and that is just open persecution. You know, Jesus said in John 15, he says, they're going to hate you. He said, they hate me. They're going to hate you. Because if you truly try to follow me, they're going to hate you because I'm your leader. And so you've got that to contend with. And you've got everything from subtle persecution in the world and various cultures to outright, you know, burn them down, they burn their houses down with them in it. You got all kinds of, read the Voice of the Martyrs magazine or go on their website or something. You'll see all kinds of this stuff that's going on right now. This is not something that, well, yeah, I know they say that, but it's all just made up, or, you know, it's hyperbole or something. No. So tonight, we want to, as we take a look at this, we want to talk about, I've titled the part one here for this evening, The Nature of the Beast, for want of a better term. We are looking at an overview of a world system. And I thought one way to put it into the biblical context of Jeremiah, this guy that winds up in a well, I thought I'd give you a little bit of historical background, hopefully without getting bogged down too much. This is, most of this I just flat stole from a professor. He's dead and home with the Lord now, but got a name of, we called him Chuck. But Charlie Dyer, Charles was his actual, mother-given name, but he never went by Charles, he went by Chuck. Testament, or a professor in Old Testament at Dallas Seminary a number of years ago. And in one of his books on Jeremiah, he puts it this way, and this is, again, fleshing out some history to show you the world system, okay, the nature of the beast. What kind of world system was Jeremiah living in? And I think you're going to see all kinds of parallels to our own world as well. Okay, Jeremiah's ministry spanned over 50 years, okay, some 5 decades. His call to service came in like 627 BC. That would have been about the 13th year of King Josiah. You can find this out. You can do all the reference stuff. It's probably in any of your study Bibles in some form. You'll find some of it as far as the dating in chapter 1. We're not really going to spend any time on it. Now, King Josiah was Judah's last good king. Okay? And then it really began to deteriorate. So right off the bat, you find during this 50-year ministry that you had a cultural deterioration set in that had all kinds of spiritual decline, as well as the world system that was in. You take out spiritual truth, and you've got all kinds of immorality, all kinds of struggles, because that leads to problems with lying, cheating, stealing. There goes the economy, there goes the military integrity, there goes all kinds of things. Okay, they're not separate issues. Okay, during this period of time, there was a tremendous amount of idolatry. King Manasseh, you remember him? Nasty guy. Just an ugly character that ruled for decades himself. He had some 55 years of his rule that he just, took everything right down into the sewer as far as idolatry and his practices. On an international basis, a more of a world history, getting outside of just Israel's climate, the Assyrian Empire had dominated the Near and Mid-East for close to a couple of hundred years at this point. In its capital city was Nineveh. Nineveh wound up getting destroyed in 612, and we'll refer to that later. And eventually, that was destroyed by the Babylonian Empire, very necessary to make the connection with Jeremiah and the Babylonian Empire and everything that goes with it, because that was the period that Jeremiah primarily was in. But he had some overlap. He began with the Assyrians ruling the international scene, and then a little later on in, what's Dyer say here, 626, Nabopolassar appears on the scene. He was a prince of the upstart Babylonians, the new kid on the block, flexing his muscles in the Near East and the Mid-East. And he headed the Babylonian army, and he got to whooping up on the Assyrians and their armies. And in 626, he managed to win a decisive victory in the Babylonian area, of the world, Persian Gulf. Okay, on the western side of the Persian Gulf area, right there where the Tigris and Euphrates River all flow in, everything that goes with it. Now, he had some of his own problems. Not going to go into all the historical background, don't have the time. But Babylon's rise and Assyria's collapse brought a shift in the alignment of power within the region. I mean, all of a sudden Assyria is not the top dog, and you've got vassal states and second tier and third tier groups of people and countries that they pay attention to which side of the bread is getting buttered. And if you eliminate Assyria, if it seems to be declining, you're looking around for somebody to make new alliances with, because you really don't have the strength to stand on your own. If you're just one of these little kingdom vassal states out here trying to survive on your own, you're going to get gobbled up in almost no time. So, the power scene that's there. Judah has the good king Josiah that comes to the throne, during a little bit of an interlude there for a number of years. Egypt, jumping back to the south now, Egypt, who has lost power centuries before and has been trying to regain power as a world player, takes a look and sees Assyria's impending collapse and sees an opportunity to jump into the game once again. And here they come. In 609 BC, you've got a pharaoh by the name of Necho II that leads an assault pattern in there, King Josiah, and he finds as he gets halfway there that he doesn't like Babylon any more than he likes Assyria, and he begins, this is Necho, and he begins playing both directions, and so he switches sides at the last minute and goes over to, to buddy up with the Assyrians, who he's been fighting internationally for 300 years, but now, because Babylon's star is rising, see, this stuff doesn't get invented in the 21st century, folks. This stuff has been going on for a long time. Josiah takes a look at things and says, I need to stop because Egypt is going to come marching right dead square right up through Israel. And Josiah says, I've got to put a stop to this. That's all there is to it. I'm not for Babylon, but I certainly am not for Assyria. So he raises an army and jumps out in, of all places, familiar, called the Plains of Megiddo. Okay, this is where Armageddon takes place, yet in the future, this final battle. And he gets out there. Now, the big problem with all this is not only does Israel lose, but King Josiah gets killed on the battlefield, which is not, neither one of those are very good things for Israel. And the Egyptian army continues, on over. And remember now that you've got a big chunk of territory out there. But when you're moving 100,000 men, one of the things you've got to have is supplies. And one of the supplies you desperately have to have in an arid climate is water. So you just didn't cut cross country. There's no way to feed or water an army of guys out there. Okay, a few Bedouins on camels and stuff could survive, but not an army with that kind of people. So you had to march up through the coastal area, think Israel, until you got up almost to the bottom of Turkey, and then you hit the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates River, and then went down those to the east until you wound up in the Persian Gulf. Okay? An army would take 4 to 6 months to cover that much territory, because they marched it. So you have all of this stuff that's going on here. Now, what happened was, to kind of condense the story a little bit, right at the headwaters of the Euphrates River, I think it was Euphrates, the one on the south, it was a city called Carchemish. And Carchemish became the kind of the dividing point, the demarcation line, of what was going on. The Egyptian force could get that far. The Babylonians, taking care of the Assyrians, were pushing this far, and Carchemish became kind of the line of demarcation. And then they were there for 4 years, basically with one big army over here and the other big army over there, and Carchemish right in the middle, and you had all kinds of probing attacks and nighttime assault and all kinds of guerrilla activity and supply problems, that went with the armies, and everything went to it. But in 605 BC, you had a couple of things that took place. Okay, the most important was probably a guy by the name of Nebuchadnezzar, who was Nabopolassar's son. At this point, he was the prince, the crown prince of Babylon. Okay, he became the military commander for Pop, and headed out and led the Babylonian forces to a decisive victory in 605. Okay. At that time, Israel had gone through various vassal kings, and because Egypt had put this guy on the throne, and the Assyrians had put that guy up there in alignments, and Jehoiakim was the king. Well, he decides, seeing what's going on, he decides it's probably a smart thing. I'll switch my alliance from Egypt. I'll switch it, over to Babylon. Okay, keeps him from getting wiped out. Nabopolassar, however, Pop, back in Babylon, up and dies. Very inconvenient. Because you've got this army in the field heading towards Egypt to whoop the Egyptians, and now Nebuchadnezzar has to turn around and make a mad dash back to Babylon to consolidate the throne before some, oh, I don't know, you know, you can always trust, you know, the people back in the national capital to do what's right, you know, and he doesn't trust them a lick, and so he beats feet back there to consolidate everything that's going on, and then during this time, of course, he has gotten through most of Israel, gotten clear down to the southern border on the Egyptian front before the news reached him. On the way back by, there was a kid, a Jewish kid amongst thousands of other, hundreds at least, a kid by the name of Daniel, that wound up getting taken captive and taken back to Babylon. Okay? So that's some of the history of the book of Daniel kind of wrapped in there as well. Judah winds up continuing to be a vassal state for the next 4 years. Jehoiakim takes advantage. The Babylonian army winds up getting defeated in an interim battle, and Jehoiakim says, the tide has changed, so he switches allegiance again. This guy is a chameleon. I mean, you know, he's this way and that way and back and forth. Whoever seems to be the top dog of the moment, you know, he's throwing dog biscuits out there. You know, he's really going after it and everything else. And now he says, so he goes back and now he's supporting Egypt. You know, it's back and forth and up and yes, all kinds of this stuff. Fatal mistake, by the way. And Jehoiakim dies during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, that he comes back in 598. Jerusalem has to surrender under Jehoiakim, different guy, you know, who has a 3-month reign. If you think being the head of state is an automatic, long-term, secure type of situation, 3 months. He surrenders, you know, in 597 after a 3-month reign. Zedekiah is placed on the throne by Nebuchadnezzar, you know, simply as a vassal king, you know, just a figurehead. And at that time, there's some 10,000 people that are deported and taken back to Babylon when the army goes back through. This is probably where prophet Ezekiel winds up going back to Babylon, getting drugged back to Babylon. Judah's new king was, and I know we've never seen this anywhere else, but a weak and vacillating guy that, you know, just couldn't figure out which side or what to do or anything else. And what this all sets up is a state, you know, a system. The nature of the beast is spiritually idolatrous. It's in a disastrous situation as far as economics, as far as political integrity, has no military capabilities, basically been neutralized, you know, because it's broken up and going in all directions. There are no borders that are defensible because of national policy and everything else. And then another pharaoh comes along in 588 and decides, we're going to give it one more shot from Egypt, and just gets whopped, you know, because Nebuchadnezzar's definitely got the whole Babylon thing rolling here, and he just crushes them. And stupidly, you know, the national leadership of Israel has chameleoned and jumped sides again and aligned itself back with Egypt yet one more time, and just gets hammered in the crush and winds up then being involved in almost a 2-year siege, as the rest of the nation is totally subjugated, and Jerusalem itself as a city is surrounded and laid siege to by only part of the army of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? And then finally falls in 586 BC. And then subsequently the walls are torn down, the temples demolished, and so on and so forth. That is about a 15-minute history, you know, of everything that's going on inside of the known world of Jeremiah during this time. Okay? Pretty gruesome picture when you stop and think about it, really was. Ezekiel began his ministry in about 597, which was some years after the first writing of Jeremiah. Isaiah was a prophet from about 750 to 680 BC. So he was somewhat earlier as far as the chronology goes. And Jeremiah's probably, well, you have the history of the fall of Jerusalem. So, that was 586. And then from some of the other data, you probably have a few years even after that that goes on. Now, often overlooked, though I've already mentioned it, into this mix, and that's the spiritual decline of the nation. Now, you can't just blame the kings here that I've mentioned. You can go clear back to the time of Solomon, and you can see the inset and the onset, perhaps is a better term, of the decline of the spiritual walk of the nation of Israel during this time. Apostasy is running rampant throughout the land. You have idolatry everywhere. You have worship of foreign idols and gods, everything that goes with it. Okay? But let me just give you some takeaways here, some summary type of things. And the first one is the pagan world system will bring a time of upheaval and chaos on nearly every portion of a culture, including the spiritual status of the population. That's what happens when you get a pagan world system running the show instead of a Christian world system, because the two are so opposed that is going to bring a time of bedlam, a time of chaos, a time of upset. Right becomes wrong, wrong becomes right. People are promoting stuff that is evil, and the evil is seen as good, and everything that goes with that. Chapter 1 has to do with Jeremiah's call. You can read through it on your own. It's not my intent. Again, this is not a verse-by-verse type of thing. You find in a certain period of time in the days of Josiah, well, that's 627. So that's when we put that date on there. And it's kind of interesting because Jeremiah was a little unique in how he records God reaching down and tapping his life, okay, for this view from the well. Okay? You look at it, okay, in verse 4 of chapter 1. The word of the Lord came unto me, saying, before I formed you in your mother's stomach, belly, I knew you. Before you came out of the womb, I sanctified you and ordained you as a prophet unto the peoples of the nation. Okay? God had Jeremiah in his plan before the foundation of the world, before his mother was ever became pregnant with him. Okay? And he identifies with him being in the womb, and he says, God sanctified him. Sanctified, you've probably got a different word if you don't have a King James. Sanctified, the word means literally to be set apart. And when used in conjunction with anything that has to do with God, it means to be set apart for service. Jeremiah here is saying that he was ordained, he was set apart for God's service before mom ever got pregnant. God already knew exactly what Jeremiah's role was going to be, and he understands this. Well, by the time you get to chapter 20, you find in verse 2 that Jeremiah is in the stocks. And that's, you get a picture of that. That's exactly what it was. It was you were out there in the town square with your head in your arms, inside the wooden gizmo. That's what it was. You were in stocks. Put on public display because his message was not popular. It was not popular to the leaders of the nation. More on that as we go. You'll find that out. And then by the time you get to chapter 38, you find Jeremiah has been in prison, imprisoned, which he's been in jail, incarcerated in irons. And then in that chapter, you find that he is then dropped down into the bottom of a well. Okay? And he's known as the weeping prophet, but that's where, I got the name for this, view from the well. What would you think of, for instance, in Jeremiah's day, if because of your religious zeal and speaking the Lord's truth, what would your thoughts be if you were dropped down into the bottom of a well? Now, this is not a well full of water. nor is it a well completely full of mud. The scripture, and we'll look at it later on, talks about Jeremiah being in a situation where basically he's dropped into the armpits, okay? And he can't move. He can't get out of it. He can't climb out of it. There's no water. He's not going to drown, not unless the spring rains come or something, and the well fills up. But he's down in there for, and we're not exactly sure how long, and then he winds up getting pulled back up out of the well as much. But what are you thinking about the world system that you're living in? What are you thinking about the nature of the beast? I mean, this is gruesome stuff. This is hard thing. You know, he's being put down in there for speaking up for God. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He knows what's coming. I mean, read Lamentations, and you find a record of the destruction of Jerusalem, the last few weeks or a couple of months of Jerusalem as it's destroyed, and women are eating their own children to stay alive. It is just about as nasty a situation as you know of, and this is the ministry God has called Jeremiah to. You know, as you sit there in the bottom of the well in mud up to your armpits and just a glimmer up there, you know, who knows how far, we don't know how deep the well was, but, you know, you can tell when it's daylight because it's kind of lighter, and when it goes completely dark, it must be nighttime, or it's really a thundercloud or something else. You know, pretty tough stuff. And he says, wow, this it? You know, this is not something that, at least humanly, is very appealing, isn't it? So you wind up with the second takeaway, if you want to look at it this way. God provides his chosen vessels to testify for him, both against ungodliness and for the divine promises given for encouragement in troubling times. Two sides of the same coin. The comfort level of the chosen vessel is not God's primary consideration. Yeah, stocks, imprisonment, bottom of the well in a mud hole for days. God is not primarily concerned with our personal comfort zones. I know that's not popular in American Christianity, but that's still the way it is, so you get the idea. Now, just a couple of notes that I kind of thought I'd throw in somewhere on the chronology of the book. You can drive yourself neurotic trying to figure out how everything fits in the book, okay? Because there is no chronological order. As Ezekiel starts here at the beginning of the ministry, right to the end of the ministry. That's not Jeremiah. Jeremiah ricochets just like a ball in a pinball machine. Okay, he's a go-getter. The events, as I said, start about 627 and probably go into, that are recorded, and probably go through about 582 or 580. Okay, some 50 years, give or take, of events. It's kind of grouped in very generally. And you say, how is it put together? Well, it's hard to say because all the experts don't agree with anybody. Chapter 1 is pretty obviously the call of Jeremiah. Then you've got the majority of the book, the part we're going to primarily deal with, is God speaking to the nation of Israel in judgment primarily, but also with the promise of restoration. And then there's the latter part of the book has God's judgment of the Gentile nations. And then chapter 52 is, here's a summary of the outcome. That's kind of very generally, and most people will, argue about it. How's that? And again, you got to fit in Lamentations if you really want to understand Jeremiah in its completeness. Figure in that as well. By the way, there is an Old Testament term that's used quite a bit in the book of Jeremiah. There's several of them, but this is the one I want to speak on for a moment. And that's the term backsliding. Okay? We use that term kind of in a generic sense because that term is not used in the New Testament. Okay? It's an Old Testament term that has to do with the national covenants of Israel and how that worked out. You'll find it, about every other chapter has got at least one usage of that. In chapter 3, 6 through 11, for instance, chapter 8, verse 5, and everything that goes with it. You will have it referenced a couple of times in the New Testament, but it's always a reference to the Old Testament status of Israel and its spiritual relationship, see, walking away from the promises of God, okay? Backsliding, okay? Sliding backwards. It's the idea of, leading a cow up a steep, muddy grade, okay, and then she gives a jerk on the halter rope and slides backwards, all right down through the mud, all the way to the bottom of the hill again. It's sliding, obviously, sliding backwards, but it's a term that has to do with that, okay? Lots of different things. You can look up James chapter 1, 22 through 24, and you get an idea of how that plays out in the New Testament, okay? Let's profile something. Let's go to some of the heart things that we're going to be looking at and integrating in the weeks ahead. Chapter 2 of Jeremiah. And to give me a break and a drink of water, would somebody read verse 8 for us, please?
The priests said not, where is the Lord? And they that handle the law knew me not. The pastors also transgressed against me, and the prophets prophesied by Baal, and walked after things that did not profit.
Okay. Thanks, Libby. What you have in chapter 2 is kind of a description of the overall spiritual status of Israel and God's charges, okay? His accusations, his charges against how they were living. Okay? And there's some pretty important stuff in here as we look down through it, because it kind of sets the tone for, the first 45 chapters. Okay? That's how long this descriptive situation about God's judgment upon Israel takes place. And he challenges them, beginning in verse 5, to think about these things. And he says in verse 7, I brought you into a plentiful country to eat the fruit, but when you got here, you defiled my land and made my heritage an abomination. And then he lists 3 categories in the verse that Libby read to us, verse 8. The priests, the pastors, you can interpret that, shepherds. It doesn't have the same meaning here as it does in today's church. And the prophets, okay? Here's the problem, and we'll just give you some definitions for now. None of these categories were doing what they were supposed to be doing. The priests were the instructors. You'd almost call them the school teachers for the nation. And they were the instructors that were to teach the people of the country about God. These were the scribes. These were the Pharisees and so forth. They were primarily the instructors that were there. Then you had, King James' word is shepherds, the leaders. These were responsible in civic and political areas to lead in righteousness. Today we would talk about them, generally speaking, as our political and civic leaders. These are the people all the way from the White House in Washington, D.C., all the way down to the town mayor of Cambridge. You've got all of these people. These are the people that are responsible to lead in righteousness. Okay? These are the leaders. Most translations have that. And then you have the prophets, or if you're going to put it in today's term, the preachers. Okay? These are people proclaiming the specific truths of God's word. Men that were to declare the wonder, the majesty of God and provide the spiritual direction that the people needed. And the comment that God makes here is the priests, where is the Lord? Now, they weren't directing people to the Lord. They said not, where is the Lord? They that handle the law didn't even know me. The pastors transgressed against me in like manner, and the prophets, they said, Baal says this. No, they were promoting false idols, false gods. Okay? And they did not, and they were interested in personal profit. rather than taking care of the people. So you have another takeaway here, don't you? I mean, I think you can come to some of these conclusions if you just think about them. God holds accountable the actions of those in the civil arena of a nation. And it's God's standard that's the yardstick for judgment, not the laws that men pass or the contemporary acceptance of this is right and this is wrong according to such and such, not at all. It's God's standard. He's the one that says this is right and this is wrong. And God holds the leaders of the whole nation accountable right here. Well, I'm going to suggest to you, if we jump just a few verses, chapter 2 has got several of these, but if you go down to verse 13, and if somebody would read that verse, chapter 2, verse 13.
For my people have committed 2 evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water.
Okay. He said there are 2 core elements in God's accusations against Israel. Okay. He says the leaders have flat blown it. And this is the result. Here are the charges. This is what I'm going to hold you accountable for as a nation. And the passage, of course, you can fill in the in-between. He says, my people have gone after other gods and everything. But he says in verse 13, my people have committed 2 evils. This is what he lays out here, his key concept. 2 evils. Number 1, they have forsaken me, who is the fountain of living water. So I'm the God of life. I'm the God that's granted them life, individually and as a nation. I'm the God that brought them out of Egypt and into the promised land. I'm the God who did all the miracles and kept them alive. I'm the God that provided all of that plus more. And he says, they have forsaken me. Okay? Yeah, they've forsaken the one true God who provides life. Yeah. If you make a note, I'm not going to go to it now, we'll come back to it later in the study, in chapter 8, verses 8 and 9. You have a couple of statements here that are very, very similar. He says, how do you say we're wise and the law of the Lord is with us, when certainly in vain made he it? The pen of the scribes is in vain. The wise men are ashamed, they're dismayed and taken. Lo, they have rejected the word of the Lord. Where is the wisdom in that? They have rejected the word of the Lord, and yet they claim to be wise. Wow. Yeah. Chapter 11, there's multiple places, but just keep it in mind. We'll come back to it. The second key that he states here in verse 13 is not only have they forsaken me, they have hewed them out cisterns. Now I'll try to build a picture for you. Broken cisterns that can hold no water. The imagery here, okay, is that God is the fountain of living water. They've forsaken him, and now they have substituted gods of their own making. They said, we don't like God's fountain. We're going to go over here and create our own vessels. We're going to create our own cisterns, our own holding tanks. We don't want the God of the Bible. We're going to replace him with our own gods of our own making. Okay? And God says they're useless and they're without life. Dave?
The quality of the water would be water that would collect in a cistern would get stagnant after a while and not be very attractive as compared to a fresh, live spring water.
Exactly. That's a good observation. It really is. Okay. So you see how this packages together. Parallels in the church age, my goodness sakes, they're all over the map. But in Jeremiah's day, if you just briefly note, and that's all I'm asking you to do right now, chapter 11, the first 8 verses says that they have an imagination that comes from their evil heart. They have denied God's covenant and have replaced it with their own imagined value system. Again, the nature of the beast that we're dealing with here. The parables in the church age, well, Titus chapter 1 tells us, you know, that, I'll just flip over there. Somebody read in chapter 1 of Titus, verses 17 and 18. There are so many of these passages that it's amazing. Titus 1, verses 17 and 18.
Titus 1 ends at verse 16.
Oh, I'm sorry, 15 and 16. Thank you, Tim.
Unto the pure all things are pure, but unto them that are defiled and unbelieving is nothing pure, but even their mind and conscience is defiled. They profess that they know God, but in works they deny him, being abominable and disobedient, and unto every good work reprobate.
Okay, yeah, I'll fix the typo. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Unto every good work reprobate. You know, they claim a relationship, but their lifestyle, their actions are completely contrary. You know, they're not walking the talk. You know, that's the thing. You find that tremendous passage in Romans chapter 1. I'll just refer you to it, where God tells us that people have substituted. You know, they look at creation and they see the hand of a creator, but they don't want the accountability of recognizing the authority of a creator. So they carve out wooden idols. They carve out stone idols. They create just what Jeremiah was talking about. You know, they are going to come up with their own substitutes that make them more comfortable, and God is going to turn them over. The King James is to a reprobate mind. He uses that term 3 times. I'm going to turn them over. He says, he's in essence, he says, I'm going to let it run its course. I'm going to withdraw my hand, and I'm going to let them have their way to the end of their way. And it's a complete disaster. You know, you've got in there everything from homosexuality and all kinds of vileness that is listed at the end of the chapter, all kinds of stuff. Romans chapter 10 says that a lot of these people have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. You know, they don't recognize, you know, the finished work that God has provided. So you have a 4th takeaway. The core issues of men's relationship to God are both currently existent and valid through the ages of mankind. Okay? These core issues are there. They didn't just come up in the New Testament. They didn't go away with the close of the Old Testament. You know, they have permeated the ages of man all the way through. Okay? One final concept as we put the finishing touches on here, and that's the issue of the heart. Okay? I think this one is kind of important. It really is. In chapter 4 of Jeremiah 4, if I didn't get a typo here, somebody read verses 3 and 4 for us, if you would.
For thus saith the Lord to the men of Judah and Jerusalem, break up your fallow ground and sow not among thorns. Circumcise yourselves to the Lord, and take away the foreskins of your heart, ye men of Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem. Thus my fury come forth like fire, and burn that none can quench it, because of the evil of your doings.
Okay, thank you. It uses a rather interesting phrase here when he tells them to circumcise yourselves to the Lord. Now, obviously, he's not talking about physical circumcision. He's talking about spiritual. And to take away the foreskins of your heart. Okay? Kind of graphic as far, you know, as, you know, human organs and so forth. But you kind of get the point. Okay? There is a covering over there that, you know, needs to be removed to get to the reality that's underneath. Quit playing religion. Quit trying to be pleasing to God on your own terms. Don't do that. You have to make the commitment. And the problem is you got a heart issue. Okay? You got something covering the heart, and the heart is not a trustworthy thing. In chapter 5, I'll just speed through these things a little bit, a couple of them here. In verse 30, it tells us this: a wonderful and horrible thing is committed in the land. The prophets prophesy falsely. The priests bear rule by their means, in other words, for their own profit. And my people love to have it so. Where's all this going to end? In chapter 7, verse 24, they hearken not to me, they incline not their ear, but walked in the counsels and imaginations of their evil heart. And they went backward, not forward. That's called backsliding in other places in Jeremiah. Okay? There is a heart problem. He uses this terminology of the problem with the heart throughout the book. Somebody, let's go over to chapter 17. You'll have to jump a couple here. And this is probably one of the best known passages in Jeremiah. Somebody read verses 9 and 10 for us, chapter 17.
The heart of the deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind, even to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruits of his doings.
Mankind has a heart problem. He really does. The heart is deceitful and wicked above all things. So when you use the terminology, I just felt like this was the right thing to do. You are on extremely thin ice, folks, if you make decisions based upon a gut feeling, however, whatever terminology you want to use. Okay? Your emotions, your circumstances, what just seems to be, well, this appealed to me, I just felt that, not a good way to make decisions that might very well be completely displeasing to God. Very much that particular direction. By the way, did you know that God never says trust in your heart? Not there. No, he tells us we are to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. In places like what, Romans 12, verse 2. You know, we're supposed to have a different mindset. We're supposed to be thinking on things above. We're not supposed to be making decisions on that. There's supposed to be a metamorphosis. God is not interested in giving you a new coat of paint. He's not interested in turning the leaf over to look at the other side. He wants a new creation that is clothed in righteousness. It's entirely different than oftentimes what's expressed today. He's not interested in remaking the old man. He's talking about providing righteousness for the actions of the new man. Okay? So you wind up with a fifth takeaway. The emotional center of man is suspect when it comes to providing a solid perspective to determine God's will. Suspect. Men are brought into alignment with God's righteousness when they are obedient to the teaching of his word. What a distinction. So we live in troublous times. We really do. There's all kinds of rejection of God's truth. People are looking for substitutes because they don't like what prophets of God, like Jeremiah, were the message that were being brought to them. And you hear all kinds of stuff that's going on. You really do. That's the nature of the beast. The nature of the beast says, let's look at what is best for the most instead of what's right because of what God says. Okay? The nature of the beast shouts for the good of the people and indoctrinates the masses, and you wind up with cattle cars and ovens. You really do. You wind up with lemmings following the piping, heading for the cliff. And you have, but the prophets, the priests, all those guys, they're the leaders of the nation. They're, the leaders know best. The leaders are the ones that crucified Christ. They don't always know best. God knows best. Okay? They've forsaken me and replaced me with broken vessels, God says in that key verse in chapter 2. Okay? They've replaced me. They've rejected me and my truth and replaced me with the choices they want. And he says, I'm going to judge them for that. And he just flat takes out Israel, okay, over the next, 6 months in Israel's history chronologically. Jeremiah clearly saw the selfish and rebellious nature of mankind, okay. So we want to kind of develop next time some core issues that are found throughout the book of Jeremiah that Jeremiah was probably seeing pretty clearly, even from the bottom of the well, okay. Father, thank you as we bow before you, praising you for providing insight into the nature of the beast, how things operate in a pagan world system, and the contentious nature when that system that wants to create its own gods comes face to face with the reality of spiritual truth according to the Bible. We thank you, Lord, for allowing us this time, and we trust, Lord, it honors you. In Jesus' name, amen.